has created a fair number of environmental disasters. And so there is a nascent environmental movement in Turkey as well. But generally speaking, they're not politically very successful. They tend to attract the support either from some of the impoverished peasantry or from just the opposite end, from urban elites. It's not enough numbers to add together to actually influence policy. Go ahead.
We come about the history of the last 50 years. If you were to give this same talk 50 years from today,
I'm not going to be alive, but okay.
if you did, how do you think it would be different 50 years from now?
I would imagine it would be very different, because my only basis of comparison is the 50 years ago. Okay, 50 years ago, I wasn't born. I'm 49, so it's just to cut off a little bit. But really, in 60s, I have a peculiar family background. My mother's American, my father's Turkish. And so 50 years ago was precisely the time when my mother actually pulled up stakes from California and moved to Turkey with my father. And the environment then in Turkey was actually both politically and economically, across the board, was very different. And really at that time, Turkey was held up as a model for Muslim countries around the world as an example, a successful example of secularizing, of modernizing, and the idea was that Turkey is a track that everybody else should follow. So Arab countries would be said, well, maybe they should do things like Turkey and so forth. Maybe then go forward into, say, about 1990, go 25 years later. Then Turkey started to develop a reputation of a country that was re-Islamizing, but also had adopted lots of neoliberal economic changes and so forth, and had developed sort of sporadic spurts of high economic growth. Up and down with crises and so forth, as always happens, but it had really started attracting Western investors a lot more. And even more so, Gulf money started coming into Turkey. And go into, say, for example, the year 2003, 2004, in the Western press, you would have Turkey praised to the high heavens of being the model everybody else should follow, but for exactly opposite reasons of 50 years ago. Now they were the model, Turkey, of reconciling conservative Islam with a modern economy. Nowadays, the shine has gone off of that a little bit with Erdogan pissing off Western interests a little bit more. But a lot of things have changed. So therefore, looking 50 years into the future, I think my best thing is to refuse to do so. Because if it's anything like the past, it's going to be very unpredictable. Go ahead.
What are some specific criticisms against Sam Harris?
Okay. Sam Harris hit the scene, made his name by his book, I think it was in 2004 or 2005, called The End of Faith, which was a broadside against faith in general. So he didn't really single out Islam as different in that regard. But he really did single out Islam as a kind of the most virulent example of faith. And he really associated Islam with violence in a rather unique way. And if you look at the footnotes of the book, The End of Faith, and you know somebody is an academic when they tell you to look at the footnotes. If you look at footnotes in Sam Harris's book, there are only a couple of references to books or articles that really have anything to do about Islam, and those were from American and Israeli nationalist sources, not exactly your best sources. So my impression of Sam Harris is that he hasn't done his homework. He doesn't actually really know what he's talking about. He does these very broad brush descriptions of Muslims which fail on the face of it. So my real beef with him is just basic inaccuracy. It's not like that. And I'm saying this as somebody who's non-religious, who grew up in a Muslim environment, and my idea of a religion I want to avoid, keep away from me, is largely conservative Islam. I mean, if even I'm not sympathetic with Sam Harris, you can imagine the Muslim response to what Sam Harris wants. Back there?
Yeah, I was curious about kind of similar to questions that have been asked with regards to what you were saying about sort of. I thought it was really interesting what you said about economic development that might not be in line with Islamic law, but has largely allowed. And I was wondering if that has differed in sort of officially secular countries like Turkey compared with countries like the two that you mentioned as outliers, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I guess I was just wondering in general, and I know this is really broad, but sort of trends you see in terms of tolerance between officially secular states with majority Muslim populations.
I'll try my hand sort of at that. One problem over here, if you're, say, for example, looking at indicators like economic performance, Saudi Arabia and Iran are very difficult to compare with, say, I don't know, Indonesia or Bosnia or whatever other Muslim state you're going to look at, because Iran and Saudi Arabia both have oil-driven economies, and so they therefore are subject to the famous resource curse, which economists talk about, which the idea is that if you have a country where the economy is very much dependent on extracting mineral resources, particularly oil, they actually tend to perform less well over the long run than countries you might think are actually worse off because they don't have oil. So really, we shouldn't be comparing Iran and Saudi Arabia with others in that regard very well. And I particularly want to emphasize places like Turkey and Malaysia and Indonesia, a certain degree Bangladesh and so forth. Well, mainly because the weight of population in Islamic countries is really there. It's not in the Arab countries. And the more appropriate comparisons, perhaps, are not with officially secular versus non-secular, because there are just too many confounding variables. You don't know what the causal things are. But you can make slightly better comparisons. It's social science, it's not physics, so you always have to have caveats. But you can compare countries with other countries that are not Muslim in a relatively similar situation. And this type of social science has been done fairly often. And usually what happens is that the performance, whether it's in economics, whether it's in other social indicators like education, so on and so forth, Muslim countries usually perform at about the same level of neighboring comparable countries that happen not to be majority Muslim. So it's really not very different. So if you're trying to find some sort of key to what's happening in Muslim populations in terms of, say, economic and social development, there probably isn't a key, and probably the key is not Islam. It's just too widely varying. So I don't know if that really answers things, but that's the best I can do, I think. Any other questions? Go ahead.
This is, but when it comes to addressing these kinds of issues with like the Islamic community, at the same time, like in our current society, there's also this growing trend that in America and Europe of distrust of Islamic communities. How should we try to reconcile like criticizing this while at the same time reconciling that with the fact that there are communities that might face legalized discrimination like that?
That's a very tough question, in the sense that it's very hard. Okay, the question is about how do you reconcile an impulse you might have to criticize, say, Muslim communities, or even just criticize Islam intellectually, with also, how do you reconcile with this, with the sometimes vulnerable position that Muslim minority communities find themselves in right now in North America and Western Europe. And this is it's a difficult balancing act. I know people both in Western Europe and in the United States who actually engage in intellectual criticism of Islam. A couple of them are philosophers and things like that. This is their job, that's what they do. But very often they get accused of, say, Islamophobia, because they're saying things about traditional Islamic beliefs, saying, well, no, this doesn't quite work. And in those types of contexts, I just have to say that you kind of have to go and do your job. And if you're being accused of Islamophobia, well, that kind of goes with the territory. Let's hope it really doesn't affect you too badly. But on the other hand, there's always an on the other hand of these things. For example, last year I also had another book come out, but it was a sort of a co-edited book with a bunch of historians of science. And what we were doing was we were examining some myths about the history of science that have become very popular in Muslim populations. And one of the things that we were doing, we were criticizing this exhibition called 1001 Inventions that's been traveling all around the world for very great acclaim. And it's actually been in a couple of locations in the United States as well, in Washington, D.C., and in San Francisco, and so forth. And, or LA, sorry. One of the things that happened in the process of our sort of publicizing criticisms of this religious misrepresentations of the history of science was that some of this type of criticism was picked up by websites that were associated with Islamophobic names like Pamela Geller and so forth. So suddenly I was looking on the web and somebody like Pamela Geller is also hitting on that exhibition for misrepresenting the history of science and everything like that. So you run that risk if you're doing a sort of scholarly criticism of what we think are misconceptions that are common, particularly in Muslim populations. It's quite likely that somebody who really does have Islamophobic motives is going to up and run with it and say, oh, you Muslims are so backward and so useless and everything like that. You can't control that. I really don't know what to do about it. I just count myself fortunate that I am not well known, and so therefore I don't have to worry about this. It pays in life not to have any influence over me. Go ahead.
I have a question, and I have to confess, I come from a more conservative viewpoint.
Sure.
of things. Why was there such, it seemed to me in the election that there was a lot of money that came from Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
the Clinton Foundation.
Mhm.
There was, Huma Abedin was her
Right.
advisor. There's a lot of connection there. There's a lot of money, money from the United States that went to Iran.
Mhm.
And you said that they were very more, I don't know.
Okay, what I possibly can, I don't know if I can answer that question directly because I don't know the machinations going on in the Clinton Foundation or anything like that. I really have nothing to do with them. But I may be able to tell you a few things about how this past election was viewed in Muslim countries. Generally, actually, right now, for example, the Saudis tend to be very happy with the election of Trump. They think they're going to be better off. In Turkey, I think, from the news I've been reading over there, they really don't care one way or the other. They hated them both. There is that thing in the Middle East, especially if you're looking at, particularly the Middle East, not say, I can't speak in this regard for say Pakistan or Indonesia or anything like that, but in the Middle East, the past couple of decades, starting with the Iraq War, the perception has been that the United States has been out to essentially destroy the Middle East. And you tend to think that way when bombs are falling on you. And this has been a bipartisan thing. And the Democrats are, in some ways, often these days, perhaps more intensely hated than the Republicans in the Middle East. Particularly figures like Hillary Clinton. For example, I have a friend who actually lives in the United States right now, but who's very much a Turkish nationalist. Sometimes it happens. Immigrants tend to be even more nationalistic when they move away from their home country. And she hated Hillary Clinton's guts because she associated Clinton with the Middle Eastern policies of the last decade or so, because she was Secretary of State. And she voted for Trump. Not because she was particularly religious or anything like that. It's just, she just hated the guts of the Democrats because of foreign policy.
From my perspective, I didn't know how we ignore the fact that they were giving her so much money. And
Yeah, the whole money part of it, I really can't say much about. That's just sort of way out of my expertise. As I said, hopefully what I'm saying about the public perception of Trump versus Clinton, Republicans versus Democrats, I can say a little bit about that in the Middle East. And in that sense, if you're sort of thinking that perhaps because of the money coming to the Clinton Foundation that perhaps the Saudis and Middle Eastern elites were gunning for Clinton to win, not quite. they're actually rather happy with Trump right now. And depending on the policies to come about, that may change. Trump starts bombing a couple of countries, everything can turn upside down again. These things change very quickly. And as to what's happening sort of underneath the table with various money passing back and forth is hidden to me. I can't say anything. Anything else? Go ahead.
When you stated that, well, Islam, we know, is very rigid, and when you stated that they went against Islamic law and allowed corporations.
Well, it's not so much going against Islamic law, is that Islamic law had not envisioned anything like a corporation.
Okay.
Corporate bodies as a whole, not just economic corporations, but even things like, say, cities as a corporation, colleges, universities as a corporation, that type of legal structure didn't exist in classical Islamic law. But particularly in the 19th century, they were adopted very, very quickly.
Okay, so they didn't change the law.
They didn't change the law.
Adopted into it.
There's actually considerable flexibility in interpreting Islamic law. And especially if they think that it's going to be practically useful in commercial terms or something like that, somebody will come up with a ruling saying, okay, it's now okay according to Islamic law. That's never been a problem. Islamic law has a reputation of being rigid. It is perhaps rigid in some areas, but by and large, historically speaking, probably is more flexible than rigid. I mean, think of it this way. I mean, it's sort of like, if you look at the Christian world today, you're talking about billions of people with thousands of denominations and lots of very, very different and conflicting ways of interpreting the same sacred text. Much the same is true about the Islamic world. When I'm talking about Islam, sometimes, of course, especially in a talk like this, I have to use a broad brush. But we are not talking about an area where there's widespread agreement about many religious things. One of the main things you know you're Muslim is if you're arguing with other Muslims about points of religious interpretation, and you typically disagree with other Muslims. The fact that you're arguing is what makes you a Muslim. The fact that you actually care about particular sacred texts is perhaps what makes you a Muslim, not agreement on their interpretation. And but again, you can say much the same thing about Christians, right?
We want to take Sarah's question as the last question here.
I was just curious about pan-Islamism and nationalism, and essentially not asking you to predict the direction that it's going to go 50 years in the future, but in the next couple of years.
Okay, are we talking about pan-Islamism as it was 100, 150 years ago?
No, we're talking about the pan-Islamic movements like the New Caliphate, for example.
Okay. These, right now, the notion of, the pan-Islamic movement, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about peoples whose political ideals revolve around uniting Muslim countries that right now are split across sometimes very arbitrary and colonial borders, having some sort of Muslim unity, perhaps under the figurehead of a caliph or something like that.
Yeah.
Right now, this is not a very strong political position in most Muslim countries. Islamist movements in general are usually quite happy sticking within their own boundaries and contesting elections in their own country. There are some quasi-exceptions. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood tends to be more international across borders than, say, Turkish or, say, Indonesian, Malaysian Islamist movements. But that's also because there's a little bit of an Arab nationalist element in the Muslim Brotherhood too. It's one of their influences.
Is that the same with Wahhabism?
No, not at all. Wahhabis are much more of they're much more Saudi and Gulf based.
Okay.
They're sort of more of a very rigorous Puritan Sunni point of view. So their emphasis is much more religious rather than political. And the Wahhabis really would not have much influence if it were not for the wealth of Saudi Arabia. They're very much a minority position, but they've been able to use their money to fund Wahhabi training schools, madrasas all over the world. So there's been a new generation coming up in many countries who've been taught that Wahhabism is really the pure, genuine Islam, rather than those superstitions your parents believe in and things like that. But if it weren't for that, the Saudis really wouldn't have a lot of influence. I mean, and as I said, Islamist movements right now who enjoy political power or have prospects of real political power, I can't think of any who would look to Saudi Arabia as a model for it and say that, hey, we want to institute something in Saudi Arabia. It's just not done. Generally, Muslims do not like Saudi Arabia. It's a... Okay, anything else? I mean, I'm losing my voice, so you might as well.
I think let's close there, and if you want to have more questions, come up and talk to the
Right,
back
okay.
there.
So I don't have to shout anymore.